Perfect.
So
Is
you're
it
good.
in presentation mode or is it just in the basic mode?
It's just in the basic mode right now.
Wow. Okay.
There you go.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining our panel. My paper, called the Aborigines Protection Society from the Bottom Up, uh, presents some of my analysis of letters written from the British South African colonies to the London-based Aborigines Protection Society in the 1870s and 1880s. And I'm going to call it either the Society or the APS because Aborigines is a really hard word to say over and over again. And my overall thesis is going to be that for people in the colonies, both settlers and African people, who wrote to a London-based humanitarian organization, writing to them was not just about being humanitarian. It was also, for many people, a means of claiming perceived political rights that they thought they had to intervene in imperial politics in the British House of Commons by writing through a third party, by writing to the society. And I'm going to make that argument first by sort of introducing what the society was and why letter writing was so important to it, and also introducing the concept of imperial citizenship compared to the concept of imperial subjecthood, because it's quite different. And then the meat of my argument, the meat of my paper, is applying the lens of imperial citizenship to two case studies of people who wrote to the society. One was a white settler from Natal, and one was a Swana chief from modern-day Botswana. So the Aborigines Protection Society was founded in 1837 on the back of the anti-slavery campaigns in the same sort of moment that Catherine referred to of increasing popular politics. And it's important to realize that even though it's called the Aborigines Protection Society, it doesn't jive with what we commonly think of today as social activism. It wasn't about stopping colonization at all. It was about creating a better scheme of colonization that's compatible with the safety and the improvement of Aborigines. So it's not what we modernly think of as a very progressive society. But in the 19th century, it was quite important because it was a society that was founded on the idea that indigenous peoples throughout the empire were treated immorally and unjustly, and its sole objective was to improve indigenous settler relations. And it sought to do that through two mandates. Its first was to gather accurate information on the state of indigenous relations in the colonies by constructing a correspondence network, by corresponding with local informants to get the real information. And then second, the mandate was to lobby the House of Commons using that information it gained from its personal private network. And so the society operated for almost 100 years, from 1837 to 1909. But even though it tried its best, there's very little evidence of its impact on the British Empire. Indigenous settler relations only got worse through the 19th century, especially with the rising belief in scientific racism in the late 19th century. And by 1909, there was so little support for the society that it merged with the Anti-Slavery Society, which still exists today. So historians have generally concluded that the APS fails. It was a failure. However, my contention is that it might have failed at its second mandate. It failed to change policy, but it did succeed at constructing this massive empire-wide correspondence network, which the remaining letters within this network total about 10,000 letters written from all parts of the British Empire. And it's some of those letters that I'm talking about today. And what really drew my attention to these letters was the way that both the society at the time and modern historians constantly refer to the people who sent them as just informants. Because that's a very society-centric, very metropolitan-centric view, that it filled a role of informing the society, but we don't really know why they are providing this information in the first place. Why were thousands of people from the British colonies writing to this London-based humanitarian organization? Like, what was in it for them? Were they just trying to be humanitarian? Or did they consider this correspondence a means to an ulterior end? And there are, of course, very many answers to that question. Some people certainly did just want to be humanitarian and support the cause. But what I've found is that those are the minority of correspondents. Most had a pretty obvious ulterior motive. And there's a long list of what those were, from wanting funding for a business or a society of their own, trying to get a job in the imperial government, trying to get their kids into British schools. There's a long list of what people wanted from the society. But one of the most common motives for writing to the APS was getting them to represent the correspondents' political objectives in the British House of Commons on their behalf. And that's a desire that's shared across not only all colonies I look at, which is Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, South African colonies, because there's multiple, but it's also shared across demographics, from missionary correspondents, from settler correspondents, and from African and Indigenous correspondents. And so that shared nature of wanting the APS to represent colonial subjects' voices in the British House of Commons leads me to argue that it was sort of a backdoor of becoming an imperial citizen. But working with the concept of imperial citizenship is tricky because it never existed. There was never such thing as an imperial citizen. There were imperial subjects, which from 1608 came with one right, and maybe two rights. First was the right to be tried by English law, and the second was the right to petition to be tried by English law. That's the only legal right ever given to subjects of the empire. Citizenship was much more exclusive, and you had to become a citizen of each individual territory. So you could be a citizen of Britain if you met the property qualifications and gender and age and religion and all those different sorts of local expectations. But you could also be a citizen of the Cape Colony or Natal. You couldn't be just automatically a British imperial citizen. But even though it didn't exist, people acted like it did. Subjects tried to claim rights that they believed they had as subjects, which are actually more like citizen rights. And that process of acting like a citizen is how I use the concept of imperial citizenship. And it's quite common to use this lens for colonized peoples, for indigenous peoples who tried to use it to protect themselves, to prove that they were equal to settler colonies by saying, well, we are equally British, so we should have equal rights. But it's less often, in fact, almost never applied to settlers, which is why in this paper I'm comparing how a black African from modern-day Botswana tried to invoke imperial citizenship versus how a white settler from Natal tried to do it as well. So I have two case studies. The white settler from Natal was named John William Ackerman. He first emigrated from Britain in 1850, first as a cotton farmer, but eventually became politician and the mayor of the capital, Pietermaritzburg, and he served on the Legislative Council for over 30 years. And it's important to sort of focus or describe what the Legislative Council was, because the topic of his little case study is how he became engrossed in this conflict with that man on the left, or my left, which is the Secretary of Native Affairs, and how he used the Aborigines Protection Society in his conflict with this man. So the Natal government in the 1870s was representative government, which meant there was a settler electorate who could elect their own members to the Legislative Council, but there was also an executive branch which was appointed by Britain, and that executive branch could also appoint its own members to the Legislative Council. So the lawmaking process was split between people responsible to the settlers and people responsible to the imperial government. And this caused all sorts of problems. And Ackerman was one of those elected settler members who, in 1875, came into conflict with the Secretary of Native Affairs, who is Theophilus Shepstone. And the nature of this conflict was over control of native law. So in Natal, legal system was completely segregated. So settlers, white people, were tried by English law, and Africans were tried by native law, which native law was not codified, And it was essentially whatever the Secretary of Native Affairs said it was, because no one knew what it was. And this led to this sort of domination by the imperial government through this imperial executive that the settlers, including Ackerman, really despised, because they wanted to control native law themselves. And so they tried to pass this bill, 1875, to remove control of native law from the Secretary of Native Affairs to the settler-elected government. And this bill failed because Shepstone and his nominated council members were able to amend the law and keep himself in control. And Ackerman, knowing that he couldn't amend this through the colonial government anymore because the colonial government had passed the bill, so he had to go to the imperial government. And he could have petitioned. He had a right as a British subject to petition the imperial government, but he didn't want to because he was an elected politician, and if the settlers saw that he was appealing to imperial government, they would not have liked that very much. So he had to do it quite secretly, and he tried to do it through the Aborigines Protection Society. So for over 3 years after the Native Administration Bill was passed, he corresponded as an informant, sending information on this bill to the society, but he also sent them meticulously crafted questions and grievances that he wanted the society to raise in the British House of Commons on his behalf, in order to get the imperial government to overturn the Native Administration Bill. So it wasn't always just a question he provided them. He would sometimes give them specific examples of which MP he wanted to ask the question and who he wanted to target to, such as some of the brief quotes on the side there. And the society actually followed through on this. They got some of their allies, for example, Mr. MacArthur, to raise his questions in the House of Commons for him. And those questions were shot down. They did not work at all. And as quite common in almost any petition or any Indigenous or African delegation to the imperial government at this time, they didn't work. Imperial government was not interested in interfering with settler politics. But it is quite fascinating that the society got Ackerman's question into the House of Commons. It sort of demonstrates that not only did Ackerman perceive the APS to be the sort of third door into having the political rights in British politics, that his perception was actually somewhat reflected in reality, because it worked. It didn't work to get what he wanted, but it worked to become a sort of imperial citizen. Now his case is interesting, especially when compared to my next case study, because his was an instance of a white settler trying to invoke imperial government or imperial citizenship to increase settler control over African society. But this next case study, Mankorwani, did the opposite. He tried to use imperial citizenship to resist colonization. So Mankorwani was a Swana chief. His territory at the time was just off the border of the Afrikaner Transvaal Republic. And throughout the 1880s, settlers from the Transvaal repeatedly encroached on his land and sustained years of low-key warfare that eventually ended in 1885 when Britain established the Bechuanaland Protectorate over Mankorwani's land. Which that is what Mankorwani had wanted. He had been asking for British protection for years to stop this encroachment. But the way that the protectorate was implemented included this one restriction that said that black people, when they're tried in courts of law, cannot be represented by lawyers. They cannot hire representation, whereas white people can. And that is a common aspect of settler colonies in different areas. Canada had this in the 1920s, for example. But there was no premise for this in South African colonies. His was the first territory where this restriction of racial discrimination was applied, and it infuriated Mankorwani. And he did petition the imperial government by petitioning the the High Commissioner, who is the highest imperial local authority in this area. But the petition failed because the High Commissioner, Mr. Hercules Robinson there, said that this isn't discrimination, this is in fact for your own benefit, because we don't want black people to be taken advantage of by unscrupulous lawyers. And that also is a very common trope to justify racial discrimination. So when Mankorwani had his petition shut down, he also, like Ackerman, had to seek a third party, sort of a backdoor, into imperial politics to try to get this overturned. And so Mankorwani, like Ackerman, went to the Aborigines Protection Society. He asked them, not quite as specifically as Ackerman, he didn't give them specific questions he wanted raised in the House of Commons, but he did give them his information with the expectation that they would bring it into the House of Commons on his behalf. And the Aborigines Protection Society ignored him completely. It believed that the letter it received from Mankorwani was written by an unscrupulous lawyer. Which is very difficult. It sort of displays some of the difficulties of epistolary networks of letter writing at this time, especially when you're having a letter written translated and transcribed by someone. You have no idea who wrote it, and so they just assumed it was probably an unscrupulous lawyer, and they ignored him. So that, compared with Ackerman, it kind of demonstrates the precarity of the strategy they used of trying to apply to the House of Commons through the society, because the society had no obligation to do what they wanted. It had its own interests, and they might get lucky and they might not get lucky. But my reason for bringing these two cases together is not to contrast their levels of success, because they are both ultimately failed. But what I'm interested in is that these two people wrote to the society in very similar circumstances. They both had tried appealing to local government figures to overturn colonial legislation. They both were blocked from their petitions. Ackerman was blocked by his legislative council, and Mankorwani was blocked by the High Commissioner. And so when they experienced that official wall, they turned to the APS as a backdoor to have their politics represented in the British House of Commons, even though they were not citizens of Britain. They had no right to be represented in that body. And so that leads to my argument that writing to the society was not just always about being humanitarian, but for many people, including these two, it was a means of gaining perceived rights that they had to imperial representation in imperial politics when they didn't really have that at all. And I think I went a little fast, but I'm not quite sure. But I want to thank you all for listening and throw a self-plug that if you're interested in any of the letters that I study, or I got a few hundred I've transcribed, they're on my website there. And so you can do your own research on these if you want to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren.